Does a change of wording by the US on its Taiwan fact sheet indicate a shift in favour of Taiwan, or should we read less into it? A statement that the US, quote, does not support Taiwan independence has been removed from its State Department website. Furthermore, previously the fact sheet said, "We expect cross-strait differences to be resolved by peaceful means." Now it adds to that, "free from coercion in a manner acceptable to people on both sides of the strait." And are these changes in response to a Chinese statement of US Secretary of State Marco Rubio's call with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi? Here's Rubio. Take a look.
And that's so two things that the game that they play. Number one is they put out an English translation and they put out a Chinese translation, and they don't always overlap. But then they put out these games. They like to play these games. They put out these translations where it says one thing in English and then it's translated in a different, they use a different term in Mandarin. So he was warned not to overstep himself. They never said that. And if they had, I would have told them, well, I would say the same to you. Don't overstep either. And but that didn't happen, at least not on the call.
Rubio is taking issue with the PRC statement, saying he was so-called warned by Wang. Rubio's State Department readout about the phone call says nothing of the secretary saying the US does not support Taiwan independence. Instead, it emphasizes, quote, the US's commitment to our allies in the region and serious concern over China's coercive actions against Taiwan and in the South China Sea. Are the fact sheet changes an effort to set the record straight? Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. Joining us today are Chong Ja Ian, National University of Singapore Department of Political Science Associate Professor, and Wen-ti Sung, Atlantic Council Global China Hub Non-Resident Fellow. Very warm welcome to both of you on the show today.
Thank you.
Professor Chong, let me start with you first. So firstly, I want to get your view. Do you think there's a connection between the two, the Wang Yi and Marco Rubio call and the changes on the State Department's website?
I don't know if there's a connection between the Rubio-Wang call and the change in the State Department website. But what I do suspect is that the changes on the State Department website are a response by PRC efforts to try to get more countries to accept or even support the PRC's position of pursuing unification at all costs. So I suppose the US wording comes as a way to sort of respond and suggest that there are other approaches to Taiwan and China's differences. And I guess the last bit there also is the PRC's, that sort of push I said, it's in line with the Xi Jinping leadership's efforts to advance its position on Taiwan in a way that's consistent with its anti-secession law.
Right, okay. And we'll get on to all of those a little bit later. The US State Department under the Biden administration removed but then reinstated the phrase the US, quote, does not support Taiwan independence. However, the phrase Taiwan is part of China was permanently removed. Wen-ti, firstly, why do these changes matter, these changes in wording?
I think this shift is in line with Trump administration broader turn towards much more transactional steelmaking diplomacy, one that's characterized often by a more maximum pressure language, but one that at the end of the day still try to not make the boat capsize, if you will. And by that I mean that if you were Taiwan, you're looking at the recent change in wording on the US State Department's website about Taiwan-US relations, you'll be thinking about a couple of things. First, there is removal of the sentence that U.S. does not support Taiwan independence. If you look at from Taipei, you might think, well, that may indicate an increase in U.S. openness to Taiwan's pursuit of its political status as it sees fit. But if you look at another way, there's addition of one additional language back into the statement as well from the U.S. side, and that addition is that there is a mention of how they want cross-strait outcome in the future to be one that's acceptable to people on both sides of Taiwan Strait. If you're looking at it as Taipei, you'll be thinking, is this potentially giving Xi Jinping somewhat of a de facto veto over Taiwan's ability to choose its own future as in line with the wishes of Taiwanese people? So if you're looking at it from Xi Jinping's perspective, you'll be thinking, oh, okay, this seems to be U.S. erecting a guardrail here. That's U.S. indicating to me that I'm not going to be supportive of the ultimate outcome Beijing doesn't want to see. But at the same time, U.S. is throwing a new additional variable that's going to make Beijing a little bit anxious, and maybe in the anxiety will get Beijing to give Washington some more bargaining chips as well. So again, driving a hard bargain, but one that may make Taipei happy a little bit, but doesn't exactly make Beijing unhappy on the matters that truly matter.
Ian, what was your assessment?
So I think the removal of the does not support Taiwan independence goes back to a phrase that was first publicly articulated by then US President Bill Clinton as part of his 3 no's. That does not support Taiwan independence line had been hotly debated and continues to be hotly debated. I suppose where I'd agree with Wen-ti is perhaps that's the Trump administration saying, well, if you want to play hardball, we can also do the same. With regard to the outcome acceptable to people on both sides of the strait, that also is reflective. It's not exactly the same language, but it's reflective of the language in the 1972 U.S.-China communique, which talks about the U.S. acknowledging, not recognizing or accepting, but acknowledging that the Chinese people on both sides of the strait need to, come to some sort of understanding, right? So that's, I guess, a guardrail, perhaps a backstop, as Wen-ti had put it. In addition, I think the bit about putting the language there also suggests that the PRC, Washington wants the PRC to understand that coercion, instability should be off the table, because that's a response, I think, to increased PRC military activity around Taiwan, but also across East Asia.
Right. And of course, we know that in the statement between President Trump and Japan's Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba, Wen-ti, they also said for the first time they oppose any attempt to unilaterally change the status quo in Taiwan through force or, as well, through coercion.
What is clear is that the Trump administration has a certain approach, and that approach is that it tends to problematize the previously unproblematic. Additional language that we just mentioned, for example, language that will make Beijing slightly anxious, for example, on a Taiwan issue, I think is one indicator. And through problematizing the previously unproblematic, they are creating new bargaining leverage where the none might have existed before. With the new development between US and Japan, I think this is an instance of we're seeing Japan playing the game effectively now with the new U.S. foreign policy, whereby Japan knows the rule of the game today is pay to play. And you're seeing Japan really upgrading its level of economic relations with the U.S. in a way that's going to, as we've seen so far, induce U.S. to feel a higher level of comfort level with showing more robust posture on that U.S.-Japan joint statement when it comes to Taiwan Strait as well.
And what are the practical impacts of including that for coercion?
Practical impact, of course, it's going to mean a higher level of deterrence, for sure. I think coming out of U.S., Japan vis-a-vis China, and I think if you're looking at it from China's perspective, it'll be like, sure, I can look at it pessimistically, or I can look at it optimistically. If I were being optimistic from Beijing's perspective, I'll be thinking, it's okay, it's a one-time thing. But if I were pessimistic, I'll be thinking, Prime Minister Ishiba right now has a lot of incentive to find room for foreign policy assertiveness projection as a way to regain political capital. So this is one manifestation, and once you have it, once the genie is out of a box, that might then create more path dependencies that make subsequent US-Japan joint statement in the future at least as tough as this, because once you pop, it's harder to go back.
Does it have any impact on China?
So I guess Beijing will probably be wondering what its next step might be. It certainly throws a little bit of uncertainty into the mix. But I guess, while I agree that the reads from what Wen-ti had expressed certainly are there, but there's also a question, I suppose, that people in Beijing will ask themselves: are these statements from the Trump administration something that we can actually believe will be there? Because one of the issues with Trump and his unpredictability is that, yes, it makes other people guess, but also makes people guess about his commitment. Is he just saying this? Are these statements that he will trade away for something? So yes, there's a degree of deterrence maybe, but there could also be an introduction of a desire or an incentive for Beijing to try to test the lines, see whether Trump really means what he says.
Okay, let's go now to the change in terms of the US supporting Taiwan's membership or participation in international organizations. So essentially what we have now is the US saying that it will continue to support Taiwan's meaningful participation in international organizations, including membership where applicable. Now this is worded slightly differently previously. Wen-ti, if you could dissect that for us, what do these changes amount to?
I think what it looks like is that whereas previously U.S. support for Taiwan's meaningful participation in international organizations like the UN, like the WHO, whereas used to be more, there used to be a ceiling to it, a visible ceiling, and that ceiling is that Taiwan will only be supported in participating in international organizations where statehood is not a requirement. Now that ceiling seems to have been lifted if you're judging from the text itself. Now, of course, if you're Taiwan, you'll be like, again, this seems to be an increase in intensity of U.S. support, at least potential support in theory for Taiwan's greater international presence. But like Ian said earlier, I think whether this is something that will be a harbinger of more to come, or whether it will be sort of a last hurrah of a strong U.S.-Taiwan relations era remains to be seen.
Ian, do you want to add to that?
Yes, so that bit about not supporting Taiwan's participation in international organizations where sovereignty is a prerequisite. That again goes back to Clinton's 3 no's, which had been very controversial. Now, at this point in time, when the US says, well, it'll support Taiwan participation in international organizations, it's a bit of a mixed bag because the current Trump administration and many Republicans, they are highly skeptical, to say the least, of international organizations.
Themselves for the U.S.
Absolutely, and we've seen the U.S. Withhold funding for the UN and also other parts of the UN system. They continue to jam up the WTO. So, if the U.S. has taken itself out of a more leading position in international organizations, it's less clear how they can advance Taiwan's membership. And secondly, even if Taiwan is able to participate, the question is, what kind of international organization are they participating in? A degraded international organization, sure, you get to some participation points, but will it really do the kinds of things that perhaps Taiwan might want? Or is it better off doing some other sort of action? That also remains unknown.
Right. Okay. So Wen-ti, we spoke about how China might be reading these signals. Given all the comments from the White House as well on Taiwan, as well as these changes on the State Department website, how confusing are these signals to Taiwan itself?
I think a lot of the changes are confusing for sure. They could all be noise, but some of them could be signal. And I think what we can do is that we had to work on the assumption that some of them are meant to be meaningful signal to at least one or more parties, and then work on the basis of that. Again, of course, if you're Taipei, you're looking at this, you're thinking about, we know that in Trump administration, there's a division between hawks and dove. We know there are hawks who are much more Fox News oriented, much more robust posture vis-a-vis China oriented. At the same time, we also know there are those who have strong voice inside the White House or next to the White House, who also have strong commercial business interests in China as well. Which side would prevail may remain to be seen. And indeed, if you look at key personnel in State Department and Pentagon at the moment, we're also, again, seeing very different voices at work. So I think for Taiwan, the point then is really to find that strategic patience and composure, focus on improving yourself and focus on building network both with the U.S. but also with other meaningful potential friends and partners, so that no matter what happens, Taiwan will have a certain level of safety net.
Okay. Right. Now, on the U.S.-China relations overview page of the U.S. State Department, every instance of the People's Republic of China was changed to just China, and the wording in the introduction became more assertive. For example, it states that, quote, the U.S. works to deter China's aggression, combat China's unfair trade policies, counter China's malicious cyber activity, end China's global trafficking of fentanyl precursors, mitigate China's manipulation of international organizations, and promote accountability for China's violations of human rights within China and around the globe. The website also mentions the CCP 3 times, an unprecedented unprecedented move compared to previous versions. I want to stay on Wen-ti because Wen-ti's on record as saying that you believe that Washington is trying to reassure Beijing with these changes that the US does not challenge CCP rule. Why do you say that?
I think there's a meaningful decision here between the China fact sheet on U.S. State Department's website in terms of how they talk about relation between China and CCP, and there's a division between how they talk about CCP in international sense and the domestic sense. The international sense, yes, there are more numerous mention of the word CCP, Chinese Communist Party, in terms of how CCP may be pursuing economic coercion, maybe pursuing cyber maneuver, other gray zone maneuvers that's disruptive or instability inducing. That's the part where it seems to be tougher in terms of Washington towards Beijing. But that's international. If you look about the bit where they talk about China's domestic situation, you see every mention of the phrase CCP getting replaced with the word China. If you're at Beijing, you think about this change on my domestic front. That seems to suggest to Beijing that, well, Washington seems to be not trying to challenge my regime security anymore. Maybe there's a sense that, at least on a domestic level, there is some kind of, if not acceptance, then acknowledgement or acquiescence that CCP, Chinese Communist Party, is going to be a default ruling party, the default polity that Washington will be working with. If that's a reading, then that will be also in line with the statement we see from the Biden administration as well, which is the so-called 5 no's. That U.S. pledges to Beijing, that U.S. has no intention of starting a new Cold War with Beijing, but most importantly, that U.S. does not seek to challenge the regime security of the current ruling forces in China. That is the Communist Party.
Essentially what they're saying is that the CCP equals China.
That's how one would read it if I were Beijing and trying to be optimistic about this. And that would be the part that's reassuring to Beijing. And Beijing would be like, yes, everything else internationally you can criticize, but on the thing most matter to me, my regime security, you are saying to me that you keep your hands off.
Ian, your reading.
So there's no sort of definitive talk about how we should read this. So not to contradict what Wen-ti had said, there's another view which says, okay, well, previously the talk about the reference to the PRC as opposed to China was done in such a way to say, okay, any differences that Washington has with Beijing, it's really about policies of the PRC state. It doesn't have a problem with the Chinese people writ large. And that also speaks to some of the concerns that people had, especially during COVID, where there was very little distinction between people, ethnicity, state by the Trump administration. And so that worried people who were ethnically Chinese who were elsewhere, also in the United States. So that distinction had that assuring effect on another sort of separate group of people. Now, the sort of read you can take by sort of removing the PRC, I think for people who are concerned about the sort of blurring of ethnicity and polity and all that, could be that, okay, so maybe given the sort of more right-wing leanings of the Trump administration, they are maybe seeing the world in racial terms again. So that could create a degree of concern. So the whole point of me raising this is that there are multiple, again, interpretations that people debate about. This whole lack of clarity suggests, that communication between Washington and Beijing and how it's being read, really creates a lot more room for uncertainty and speculation than, I think, assurance at this point.
Okay. Now, China's ambassador to Australia wrote in January that the international consensus on Beijing's One China principle is unshakable and the trend towards its control over Taiwan is unstoppable. The Economist has reported a so-called diplomatic coup by China to get 70 countries around the world to support all efforts by Beijing to achieve unification with Taiwan, marked here in red on the map. All means would include military force. Most of these countries adopted the stance within the past 18 months following China's diplomatic push toward the global south. Now, additionally, Lowy Institute finds that 89 countries, nearly half of the UN member states, support Beijing's efforts to, quote, achieve that national reunification, so-called reunification. It says, crucially, they have done so without specifying that these efforts should be peaceful, arguably consenting to Beijing using force to take control of Taiwan. So if I could stay on you, Ian, this time for this question. So this was what you were saying, that you thought the changes were more in response to this campaign of Beijing. How dangerous is this for Taiwan?
So it's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag because the PRC is trying to build legitimacy behind its case for controlling Taiwan. It is trying to, I guess, get into a situation where you have the United Nations and most of its members agree with its position. Yes, you might get that in the General Assembly, but the General Assembly doesn't decide who belongs to what or who controls what. So it might get a rhetorical victory. Whether that translates into actual control of Taiwan is a different story. And the other...
Who does get to control, by the way?
Who gets to control is essentially who, is on the territory and is able to decide, where it goes. That's ultimately, it's as you possess, or use possitatis, as people in international law might call it. So that, the sort of actual physical presence is what really matters. And the other point why I say it's a mixed bag is it's because it's not clear how much these other countries really, feel for Beijing's position. For them, Taiwan is far away. They don't think it matters to them in a direct manner. So if you're getting some sort of benefit for just some words, sure, why not? If push comes to shove and you have to actually put up some costs, will the wording change? I don't know, it could. And lastly, that Beijing's push for perhaps getting more UN member states to support its position, ironically, as the US is perhaps weakening and hollowing out the United Nations, okay, so you have a body that says something, but how much force does it actually carry in practice? That is also a question that remains unresolved.
Okay, so the lawfare that they are carrying out, or they're trying to implement, Wen-ti, is not that successful, it's not definitive.
They could be seen as Beijing protecting its sovereignty claims over Taiwan, for example. So in that sense, it's got usefulness domestically. Internationally, however, I think I agree with what Ian said earlier, which is if you're a country far away, let's say in Western Hemisphere, if you're somewhere in Africa, for example, sure, maybe I'll just agree to this line that Beijing want me to say. I'll say the magic words, then that will unlock other potential economic and other opportunity for me down the road, then why not? It's virtually no cost, potentially some benefits. So in that sense, you have a lot of countries willing to pay that level of lip service because they believe it'll be lip service only.
So it seems that you are both in agreement that essentially, even if so many countries around the world support all efforts of unification, they say this I guess it's not a legal document. It's simply, what kind of documents are these written in? They are joint statements.
Yes, I mean, they're joint statements, and so the legal force is unclear. But what I will say also is, it's a bit ironic, right? If you think about the position in the UN prior to 1971, most countries saw Taipei as the representative of all China. Did that really matter for Taipei controlling the rest of the Chinese mainland? No, but it had that sort of legal basis. So in a way, that position might be flipping. So at the UN, how much it matters, I don't know. But I suppose getting that lexical agreement, also consistent with what we were saying earlier, fits with, okay, if Beijing wants to, or decides it has incentives to really test where Washington and Taipei's bottom line is, this is where the gray zone stuff comes in. They may feel that, well, we're more empowered to do so. Other governments had said that we can, that they have at least provided rhetorical support. So cutting submarine cables, sending military aircraft and ships, perhaps trying to meddle in elections, that suddenly becomes, legitimate on the table. At least the PRC can claim that.
Okay, thank you. We're going to end it there. Thank you so much, Ian Ja Chong and Wen-ti Sung, for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching our show today. Stay safe and see you next time.